During the first week of January, my wife and daughter and I were in South Carolina, where we made a point of visiting a plantation. And it was important to us that the plantation we visited paid tribute to the history and experience of the enslaved people who lived and worked there. So we decided to visit a plantation called the Magnolia Plantation, which has preserved 4 slave cabins for visitors to learn about what daily life was like for slaves in the antebellum South. And we took a tour at that plantation called From Slavery to Freedom, which of course is the same phrase that we use to describe the exodus from Egypt, me'avdut lecherut, from slavery to freedom. And as you would imagine, the conditions that slaves lived in on plantations were absolutely inhumane. The cabins were tiny, and each cabin was split into 2 halves, and each half was given to an enslaved family. Entire families of slaves, often families of 10, 12, 14 people, were forced to live in a tiny room, a single tiny room in a tiny, tiny little cabin. After a full day of manual labor in the fields, the slaves would come back to the least humane conditions that you could possibly imagine. And what's surprising to learn when you visit a plantation in the South is that after the end of the Civil War, when slavery had finally ended, many, many slaves voluntarily chose to remain on their plantations. Roughly half the slaves at the Magnolia Plantation remained there after emancipation, and they worked there as day laborers, as gardeners, as domestic servants. In fact, descendants of many of the slaves from that plantation lived and worked on the grounds until the 1990s, which was really mind-blowing to learn. Because following emancipation, freed slaves knew no other life. They understood, maybe intellectually, that freedom was better. They understood that in theory, but they owned no land. They had no money. They had no professional prospects. And they knew that if they stayed where they were, they would have food and shelter, and all of their basic needs would be provided for. Or, to put it another way, they had internalized the slave mentality so deeply that they couldn't imagine living anywhere else. And in this week's Torah portion, which recounts the exodus from Egypt, the Israelites experience a very similar psychological phenomenon. The text tells us that God brought our ancestors out of Egypt beyad chazaka uvezroa netuya, with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. And the Torah is usually very precise with its language, so the question is raised, why do you really need both halves of that verse? Wouldn't it have been enough to say that God redeemed our ancestors with a yad chazaka, with a mighty hand? Why did the text also need to say that God redeemed us with a zroa netuya, with an outstretched arm? And one way to understand that verse is that God used a yad chazaka, God used a mighty hand to liberate our ancestors from Egypt, but he used a zroa netuya, an outstretched arm, to make sure that they didn't go back. Because they all desperately wanted to go back. They wanted to go back because it was what they knew. It was familiar. They had become accustomed to slavery. Freedom, that was something different. It was something new. It was something scary. Slavery was something they understood. And as they wandered through the wilderness, the Israelites complained bitterly, time and again, about how much better things were in Egypt. At least there they had food, they had water, they had shelter. In the wilderness, they had nothing. It would have been easier, they tell Moses, had God allowed them to remain as slaves in Egypt. In other words, after hundreds of years, our ancestors had become acclimated to their new normal of living lives in bondage. And when God saw just how accepting they had become of an existence defined by servitude, that's when God decided that it was time to liberate them and lead them to freedom. And by the way, maybe that's the real reason that God closed the Red Sea after our ancestors walked through. He closed it not to drown the Egyptians, but to ensure that our ancestors did not retrace their steps and return to Egypt. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors accepted their new normal of slavery, and today In 2024, I am deeply concerned that Jews all over the world are beginning to accept our new normal, our new state of living in a post-October 7th reality. In Israel, a constant barrage of rockets from Gaza in the south and Lebanon in the north continues to rain down on the country. And now when a siren goes off, most people stop, they spend a few minutes in their bomb shelter, and then they simply go on with the rest of their day. They're learning to live with it. Tens of thousands of displaced people, both from the north and the south, have now been living in hotels for over 3 months, and they too are getting used to their new state of living. Schools have been started in these hotels. Routines have been established. A sense of normalcy is setting in. And most tragically, I think, we are all becoming acclimated to hearing the names of the soldiers who are killed in combat, fighting in the Gaza Strip every single day. And here too, in the United States, we're getting used to living with this new normal, the new state of rampant anti-Semitism in our country. Each week, we hear about swastikas in our schools, or bomb threats to synagogues, or rallies on college campuses where the genocidal chant "From the river to the sea" is recited very openly and very freely. And we're all getting used to it. It's becoming part of the fabric of our day-to-day lives. It's becoming our new normal. But it's my job to remind you that none of this is normal. It's not normal for Israelis to have to run into bomb shelters every day for months on end. It is not normal that many, many Jews in this country have become afraid to publicly express their Jewish identities. And it is certainly not normal that for the past 3 months we have been all living in a perpetual state of anxiety and fear. This morning's Torah portion not only contains the story of the Exodus from Egypt, but it also contains the mitzvah to remember the Exodus, the mitzvah to observe the holiday of Pesach. Ushmartem et hadavar hazeh lechok lecha ulvanecha ad olam. You shall observe this holiday as an institution for you and your descendants for all time. And why do we remind ourselves of our liberation from Egypt on Pesach every year? And not just on Pesach, why do we remind ourselves of our liberation from Egypt every day in our liturgy? Because remembering the Exodus serves as a constant reminder that living with slavery, or really any form of oppression, whether it's terrorism in Israel or anti-Semitism here, that is not normal. And it is never, ever something that we should become accustomed to. 105 days after October 7th, we look to the words of our tradition for hope. May God liberate us from our new reality, our new normal, with a yad chazakah, with a strong hand, and a zroa netuyah, an outstretched arm. And let us say, Amen. We turn to page 428.